Good Tuesday afternoon, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVinoSports.com. We are going to do our conference championship week for college football early look. We'll take a look back at some of what we saw last week to set up the conference championship games. We'll talk about the coaching changes that have been coming fast and furious since the weekend. We will preview some of the bigger conference championship games of the weekend and make our best predictions on who the Final Four will be come next Sunday. To do all of that, I need to bring in none other than Rob Vino himself. Rob, how are you today?
I'm doing good today, Rob. How about you?
Doing very well. It's a big week here. Lots of games that will have a lot of impact on the four teams that will have a chance to play for the conference championship games. And before we get into all the games this weekend, let's take a look back at a couple of big games from last weekend that kind of got us to where we are today. I don't think there'd be a lot of argument from people if you were to call Michigan and Ohio State the best game of the year so far, a double overtime thriller with a little bit of controversy. Ohio State gets the win. Penn State takes care of business later in the afternoon. Penn State goes to the championship game, and a two-loss Michigan team sits home, and a one-loss Ohio State team sits home. What were your thoughts on that game, Rob?
Yeah, well, I think initial thoughts when you watch that game, you feel as if Michigan outplayed Ohio State, I would say. I thought they were the better team for the majority of the time, but certainly you can find yourself in a little bit of trouble when you get too conservative, and I don't know that that was Jim Harbaugh's plan. It's just my interpretation of what I saw after Michigan took a 17-7 lead in that contest. It almost looked, as if Michigan was trying to get that game to end rather than continue to score some more points. In the end, they wind up being tied at the end of regulation, of course, tied at the end of the first overtime, and then losing in the second overtime. Much was made this week, Rob. I'm sure you've seen it as well, about the refereeing of that contest, and perhaps Michigan has a little bit to gripe with there as far as officiating was concerned. But overall, I feel like they might have let one slip away there because they really played a good game. I think they did as good a job against that Ohio State offense as anybody's done all season long. And we didn't, expect their offense to be all that great with the quarterback situation, but it was good enough. And they did get Wilton Speight back for that game, and he played good enough to win that contest. I think it's a shame for Michigan. They've had two very, very close losses this year that is going to keep them out. A lot of people might argue still that Michigan could be considered one of the four best teams in the country, but that loss eliminates them, and it puts Ohio State, like you said earlier, they're in a position where they may go to the college football playoff without even winning the Big Ten, without even winning their division.
Now, if you are Urban Meyer, is this ideally a better scenario to being at 11-1 and not playing in your conference championship game versus being 11-1 and playing in your conference championship game? You play in your conference championship game, you risk injury. You could be playing a very high-quality opponent. You risk a loss. I mean, they only beat Wisconsin by 7 in overtime the last time the two teams met. So how do Ohio State go into this championship game? It might not have necessarily gone so well for them, whereas now they're going to sit at 11-1, and the last thing everybody's going to remember about them is them beating a very, very high-quality Michigan team, and how can you move them down after a win like that becomes the question.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think that I've ever heard that argument used by the teams that have the conference championship games. That argument is always used, at least in the instance of this year, where it could be better to be at home. that argument's always used in the Big 12 since they dropped their championship game. You know, they don't. The good part of that is that if you're Oklahoma and you beat Oklahoma State on Saturday, you can just sit back and watch with your 10-2 record, and you don't have to risk loss. That, like I say, that's always been a Big 12 type of deal. But now we do see that happening with the football playoff here in the Big 10. Could be an interesting way to look at things, Rob. I mean, there's so many different scenarios here, and I'm sure that you and I will get to all of them here as we discuss it. But, boy, I don't know what the committee is going to do here once Saturday's results are in, because somebody's going to be very unhappy in the end. And for Ohio State, maybe it's better to sit back. I think if you're Urban Meyer, though, and you have that team, Ohio State, your inclination would be we'd rather be in that game because we believe we'd win that game. Maybe if you were Penn State sitting back, it might be something that might work more in your favor. But I don't think that Ohio State ever wishes to not participate in a big game. We'll see how it all works out. Like I said, I'm sure we'll get to every single one of these scenarios as we talk. But the big deal for starters is Ohio State did what they had to do. They beat Michigan, quality football team. Obviously, they were ranked in the top 4, so it does wonders for Ohio State's strength of schedule. And Michigan doesn't have any other games left to play here. If you're Ohio State, the result of this Big Ten championship game could go a lot of different ways for you.
Ohio State, a kicking problem or just a bad day for their kicker who missed a couple of field goals that would have allowed Ohio State to win in regulation? He did kick the big one at the end of regulation to get the game to overtime. And then in overtime on 4th and 1, when Urban Meyer could have gone for the tie in third overtime, he didn't feel comfortable enough sending them back out there. They went for it. Very questionable spot, as you know. Overall, I agree with the decision from the replay booth to allow the call on the field to stand as called. I don't think there was enough there to overturn it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but what are your thoughts on Urban Meyer going forward on that 4th down and then the kicking situation at Ohio State?
Yeah, with the kicking situation is concerned, I would chalk that up to a bad day, and maybe, you wouldn't consider it with a senior kicker, or you wouldn't think it with a senior kicker, but maybe a case of nerves. It's obviously a hugely important game, but Durbin had been a pretty good kicker all season long where field goals are concerned. Now, you're talking about a kid that on the year hit 17 of 20, 85%. So I'd chalk it up to bad day. But when you have a kicker who's having a bad day, you can't blame Urban Meyer for, shedding the opportunity to kick a game-tying field goal and actually going for it. I think at that stage of the game, too, a lot of times coaches are concerned with maybe fatigue on their team, and they don't want to see that third overtime. Maybe that was built into Urban Meyer's thinking. Whatever it was, it worked out good for him, and I agree with you. I mean, the call as was, I could live with that. I don't think that there's a whole lot to get mad about there. But the kicking situation, I do think it was probably, you just chalk that up to a bad day for Tyler Durbin, and I don't think it'll have any effect going forward for Ohio State. The kid's been pretty good all season long.
I think the biggest thing that happened to Washington on Saturday, because they played on Friday and they won the Apple Cup in impressive fashion, I think the best thing to happen to them on Saturday was Colorado holding on to beat Utah in a really good game, which kept them from a rematch with a very, very hot USC team who just pretty easily beat Washington in Washington just a few weeks back. Your thoughts on the Colorado-Utah game and how that impacts the Pac-12 championship?
Well, I think either way, it's okay for Washington because either way, Colorado or USC was going to have a real high ranking here. So Washington gets a shot at a quality opponent. And the strength of schedule for the Washington Huskies has been the deterrent ever since the rankings came out the first time, right, when Texas A&M was slid into that 4-slot strength of schedule, especially non-conference, was held against Washington. The critics want to know who Washington has beaten. Well, now they've beaten Washington State in pretty sound fashion, and now they're going to get to play the number 9 team in the country, Colorado, in a championship game. And if they win there, I don't know how you leave Washington out of this at that point, Rob. Of course, it's possible. It's very possible because there's a lot of teams vying for 4 spots here and a lot of teams with good arguments. But for Washington, I think whoever won that game, because USC sits at 12 as we head into tonight to see where these two teams are ranked tonight. But having Colorado win was probably better for Washington because they're going to get a chance to play a top 10 team. USC probably would have made it inside the top 10. But with Colorado winning, that's a good opponent for Washington to have here. So we'll see. Like I say, I find it hard to believe that if Washington were to go out Friday night and beat Colorado, who's done everything right all season long, I find it hard to believe that they could get left out. But we'll see.
And we'll get to the game in a few minutes, but any advantage to Washington playing on their own on Friday night? I think the MAC or one of these other conferences is having their title game Friday night, but nobody other than people with money on it are going to care about that conference championship game. The isolation of the Pac-12 on Friday night, everybody's going to get a very good look at Washington. There's always this so-called East Coast bias towards the East Coast teams because more people see them play. Sometimes Washington doesn't kick off till 10:30, 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, and people are not having football on their mind at that point in time. You think that it could be an advantage if Washington comes out and plays a really big game Friday night and gets an impressive victory? Does that isolation factor of Friday night help them?
Yeah, and I think, like you say, the fact that it's the game to watch on Friday night is important. Everybody will be focused there. You know, you get the 2 Saturday night that overlap, both being played at 8 o'clock Eastern, Virginia Tech Clemson in the ACC title game, Penn State Wisconsin in the Big Ten title game. You would think that most eyes would be on Penn State Wisconsin, but let's not forget that Clemson, even though they're a 10-point favorite, they're still a team inside the top 4, and if Clemson were to lose, then things could really get shuffled up. So eyeballs will have to be on the Clemson game as long as it's close as well. So the point you're making, which is valid, is that, you know, you could be flipping over back and forth watching 2 games at once on Saturday night, whereas on Friday night, every single person will be focused on the Colorado-Washington game. It's a good opportunity, like you say, for a West Coast team to get exposure to East Coast viewers who haven't seen this team yet, or if they have seen them, haven't seen much of them. And I'll say the same for Colorado, Rob. We talk an awful lot about Washington here, but Colorado's a team that, despite being 9 in the country, you know, there's probably not many people, even that watch college football on a regular basis, that could tell you a lot about the Colorado team. So it's good exposure for both of them on Friday night, 9 o'clock East. That could be an important factor. If either team was to win in real dominating fashion and everybody sees it, you know, that's very helpful to those 2 squads.
Well, I'll ask this question now, but we'll talk about the actual game later. If Colorado were to beat Washington and be a 2-loss Pac-12 champion, where do you think they fall into the pecking order with some of the other 2-loss teams, such as a Michigan or a Penn State Wisconsin winner? Where would they fit in, and what are their realistic chances of making playoffs?
Yeah, and I think at that point, Rob, you'd have to throw Oklahoma in there if they were to defeat Oklahoma State, right? Because Oklahoma State rated number 10 as we speak, at least here on Tuesday afternoon. So you've got a team that beats a top 10 team and also would have 2 losses. And Oklahoma has been one of those, much like USC was, that's been talked about as being very, very hot down the stretch. And they have been. I mean, let's face it, they lost 2 of their 2 games in their first 3 of the season, and since then haven't been touched, and they've been winning by margin. So, Oklahoma would like that scenario too and say, hey, how about us? I don't know. With the logjam of 4 Big Ten teams, it's real hard to see Colorado having a chance. I think the best shot for a team like Colorado is if Clemson loses. Because I feel like if Clemson loses, they might be the odd man out, not necessarily because they haven't played a good schedule, because they've won some big games all season long. But that would mean 2 losses fairly late. It would mean a loss to an underdog, a double-digit underdog. Colorado, their chances are slim, very, very slim, but they're not going to see it that way. Let's face it. When they take the field with head coach McIntyre on Friday night, they're going to believe that if they win, they have a legitimate shot. And like I say, you and I probably could make a slight case for Colorado at that point. There's going to be a lot of teams with a lot of cases. Let's put it that way.
I mean, I think over the course of the past couple of years, people have been saying, go to 8. I think that this year, of all the years, if you were to have an 8-team playoff, I feel a lot more comfortable saying, maybe you were 8, but we ranked you 9 and you're out. You should have done something better during the regular season to make us think you're in the top 8. With only 4 spots this year and probably 8 teams with a legitimate argument that they could be in the top 4, something that I think maybe they'll start to talk about a little more, but at the same time, I also could see it devalues the regular season, and I'm convinced that the college football regular season is the best regular season in all of sports.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's no doubt about it. If you compare it to the college basketball regular season, which really means 0 until mid-February, late February, even early March. I mean, we've seen teams like the Connecticut Huskies in college basketball get hot in a Big East tournament, be lousy all year long for 30 games, play a good Big East tournament, and then roll to an NCAA title. So very little meaning to the regular season there, except for where you get seeded in that tourney of 64, 68. This regular season means a ton, and I couldn't agree with you more on this year. This year would be great to have 8 teams in because you would get all kinds of different teams, and it would be a very competitive 8-team field. You would have teams that were hot early in the year, teams that are hot late in the year. You would have teams whose schedule is in question. You would have teams that have played like Wisconsin that has played a ridiculously tough schedule. And you get that whole mixture in there of 8 teams. It would be a real good year to see that. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works right now. We're only going to get 4 of these, and somebody's going to get left at the doorstep. I'm sure there'll be some huge arguments made once the final results are in here. But I agree with you. 8 teams this year would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears a little bit before we get to the conference championship games. Something you and I have talked about a lot on the program pretty much since Les Miles got axed early in the season, that there could be a lot of good coaching openings this year, and there have been a couple, and they've been filled really, really quickly. LSU pulls the interim title from Ed Orgeron and names him their head coach after a pretty aggressive run at Houston coach Tom Herman. Whether or not Herman was ever really going to go to LSU if the Texas job became open, I would think he'd rather have been at Texas, and I think LSU read the writing on the wall and went with Orgeron. What do you think about that hire for the LSU program?
Well, I tell you, my thoughts probably are a little bit different than what's been talked about for the last 2-3 days since Ed O got that job. But way back when Les Miles got fired, and you and I did a podcast that week, and I also did a couple others, one with Sports Memo, a couple others across the country. But my thought back then was, what in the world is going to happen to defensive coordinator Dave Aranda if they go out and hire an outside head coach? Because you know that outside head coaches come in, and especially if they're high-profile head coaches, they're coming with their staff. Dave Aranda had just got signed this year from Wisconsin as defensive coordinator. Still time left on his contract. LSU played phenomenal defense all season long. The way to keep Dave Aranda was to keep the interim head coach, because if you bring in another, like I say, an outside high-profile guy, you don't know that you're going to be able to keep Aranda in there. It could have caused some confusion. So I think that had a lot to do with it, in addition to the fact that he's just a great recruiter at Orgeron, that he lives and breathes Louisiana football, that the players absolutely love him, and that the players responded to him at the end of this season. They did very well during his interim tenure down the stretch here, and we'll see how they do in the bowl game. So that's the way I feel about it. I really think Aranda had a lot to do with it. I don't think LSU wanted to lose him on the open market if they hired somebody else. So to me, it works out well for LSU. I know that there's been some question. Maybe it's an emotional hire. I'm not so sure that it's an emotional hire, because as head coach, basically as the overseer, if you can get a good offensive coordinator, a good defensive coordinator in there, and a good coaching staff, you'll be just fine. So I like what LSU did. They didn't go the high-profile route, but I think they did what's right for their university.
Thoughts on Lane Kiffin to LSU? That rumor is out there as their offensive coordinator. What do you think the likelihood of that happening is?
Yeah, that would be, I'm not real sure how that would go. Lane Kiffin is a headstrong guy. Obviously, he's been a head coach in the NFL at USC, as has Orgeron. And it seems like Lane Kiffin is able to flourish at Alabama because he can't override the head coach. And we've seen Nick Saban put Lane Kiffin in his place more than once since Lane Kiffin's been there. Whether or not that would be able to be done at LSU, I'm not so sure. Ed Orgeron doesn't seem like the same personality type as Nick Saban, and maybe Kiffin could get a little bit out of control there. I don't know that that's that great. Now, I'm talking obviously on a exterior level and not an X and O level. X's and O's wise, it'd be great to have Lane Kiffin open up that LSU offense, right? We've seen what he's done for Alabama. But I think there's other guys out there that you can get if you really want to open up your offense. I don't know that you want to take the risk of a potential personality conflict between Kiffin and Orgeron. Now, they've been together before, so it could work, right? I mean, that's probably the reason why they're even talking about it, because Orgeron and Kiffin have been on the same staff before. And maybe it could work, and my concern is silly and doesn't need to be a concern, but we'll see. I think that if it were me, I'd probably try and get, maybe Gilbert from Texas, who's free now because Charlie Strong got fired. Somebody with a wide open philosophy. I don't know how wide open LSU wants to go, but that Lane Kiffin thing could get a little bit dicey. We'll see. I always have the feeling that Lane Kiffin has his heart set on being the head man at his next job. I don't know if he wants to just move sideways across the SEC West and be an offensive coordinator again.
Let's keep moving along here. The other big one that I think was probably 50-50 before the Kansas loss and probably became about 99-1 that he was going to be bounced after the Kansas loss is Charlie Strong at Texas. Gets the boot after the TCU game. They did let him coach that one, and Texas didn't show up, didn't play well, lost rather convincingly. And then Texas immediately goes out and gets Tom Herman, who kind of was very high on the radar early in the year with the big upset of Oklahoma. Then he had a couple games he shouldn't have lost that he lost, and things cooled on him. He beat LSU, and the temperature got real hot on him again, and he lands at Texas quickly. Used to be a Texas graduate student, I believe, or graduate assistant. So has some connection to the university there. What are your thoughts on the hiring of him at Texas?
Yeah, this is interesting to me, Rob, because obviously Tom Herman came to Houston last year, and they were middle of the road, average at best, and he turned them into a bowl team and had a very good first season. Come out this year, like you said, they played well early in their first 3 games, and when Les Miles got fired, especially early on this season, his name immediately was thrown around because that team, the Houston Cougars, were hot at the time. When you look at how they closed the season, and maybe just because I look at it from a point spread perspective, but I don't know that there's a bigger underachiever across the United States in college football the last 7 games, 8 games of the year than the Houston Cougars. They played 7 games down the stretch inside their conference, the American Athletic Conference, not known as a football hotbed. They go 0-6-1 against the spread. The one push was against Connecticut. They didn't cover against anybody. Not one single ticket did they cash. Now, maybe odds makers early on had them a little overvalued off of what they did to start the year, but if you're that good, then you have to cover a point spread. And I know these coaches aren't in the business to cover point spreads. I'm talking simply from what we do here. But what it shows you is that they were an overvalued team, an underachieving team. They just didn't get done what needed to get done here. Their win, he strikes big again late in the year with Louisville. Victory there, a convincing victory, and that probably sold him the job. But I'm not so sure that at this point in time, Tom Herman deserved all the money that he got here. To me, it's just an insane amount of money to give Tom Herman.
I agree. I don't think that he's done a lot of good, don't get me wrong, but I don't think he's proven himself as the excellent coach, as the cream of the crop, as a absolute must-have to throw that kind of money at him. And I think that the fact that LSU was interested and he kind of left LSU hanging out there waiting to see what happened with Texas, and LSU basically said, look, you don't want the job, forget it, go away. And I think LSU is probably going to be very happy they made that decision in 3 or 4 years. I'm not 100% convinced that Tom Herman is the man to turn that Texas program around.
Yeah, and I'll give you just a real good comparison, Rob. If we put ourselves as the principals in charge of making the hire at the University of Texas, and let's just say that the names are thrown around to us, P.J. Fleck from Western Michigan or Larry Fedora from North Carolina, and you can get either one of those 2 guys for decisively less money. Maybe Texas would have paid the same amount to any of those 3 guys. Maybe I'm wrong there, but it seems like those guys might have come in for a little less. I know that there was probably some negotiation from Herman's agent here. But I find it hard to believe that Tom Herman is head and shoulders better as a head coach than Larry Fedora, who would have brought his UNC staff, or P.J. Fleck, who probably would have brought his Western Michigan staff. I think that you're talking about guys where one's as good as the other, and perhaps you could have done it for a little less expense. I don't know how you feel, but to me, I might have looked in those 2 directions before giving all that money to Tom Herman.
Where do you think, there's a couple of other jobs that might be coming open. There's a chance that Butch Jones doesn't survive at Tennessee. There's a chance that Brian Kelly doesn't survive at Notre Dame. And other than that, the other job openings right now, really the list isn't overly impressive other than Baylor could be a good job opening in terms of having the chance to compete in a Pac-12 against Texas and Oklahoma State. But do you see Les Miles landing anywhere?
You know, his name has been attached to Baylor in the last 7 days. We'll see how that goes, whether or not that winds up being a reality or not. I'm sure Les Miles will sit back and try to play the field. I'll tell you quite honestly, Rob, I thought more openings were going to come by now. I honestly thought that Todd Graham at Arizona State, that Rich Rodriguez at Arizona, the two Arizona schools, were in deep trouble, both. And it ended up worse for Graham because they lost to Arizona to end the season, but neither of those teams played very well this year. I thought there was a chance Jim Mora Jr. could go at UCLA. That's a guy who kind of wears out his welcome after a while, but I guess the injury concerns in all three of those situations probably keep head coaches around. There's still time, we'll see, but usually with coach fires, they don't wait too long because of recruiting season. And you talk about Tennessee, we'll see. Butch Jones, obviously, when Jalen Hurd decided to transfer, there was a lot of talk about maybe inside that locker room. Butch Jones wasn't the favorite of the players. And then they go out and lose to end the season to Vanderbilt, which just can't be done if you're Butch Jones. So there is stuff out there. There's little petty stuff out there. I mean, the University of Houston job is open right now. Wouldn't expect Les Miles to step in there. The other ones really are, at this point in time, smaller job openings. So we'll see. But Baylor to Les Miles, to get back to your original point, or Les Miles to Baylor, has been mentioned within the last 7 days a couple of times. I don't know if that's just something that is floated out there or if there's any validity to it. We'll have to see.
I mean, I would think that if the Tennessee job were to come open, I think that would be a great fit for Les Miles. He knows the SEC. He knows what it takes to win in the SEC. He would clearly be in the weaker of the two SEC conferences, and he could really build a team that could try and screw with Nick Saban once or twice a year, and I think he'd really enjoy that. I think he likes competing against those upper echelon teams. He'd get a crack at LSU every once in a while. I think that would be a good landing spot for him if that job were to come open.
Yeah, and the Tennessee fan base would probably push very hard for that. Now, they got burnt with the big money hire of Lane Kiffin, so then they turned around and they went smaller with Butch Jones, and now I think that fan base is anxious to get another big name in there, so we will see. But that would be a prime destination for Les Miles. You can recruit there. They already have built-in talent there. You talk about a team that suffered injuries. They started 9 different sets of defensive backfield in 12 games this year. They couldn't keep any defensive backs healthy. Obviously, there was trouble at wide receiver. There was trouble at running back all season long with injury. The offensive line got beat up. So they did have their share of health issues with Tennessee, but they still, guys come back healthy next year. They've got a heck of a team as far as talent, personnel on paper is concerned, and that would be a great spot for Miles. Like you say, he knows the territory, gives him an opportunity even to go against Kirby Smart once again at Georgia. You know, they had their battles, LSU and Alabama, when Smart was the defensive coordinator for Nick Saban. So, yeah, that would be a real good spot. You would think it would be a real good spot. It would be up to Miles at that point, but that could be a good landing place if, in fact, Butch Jones isn't retained.
Let's get into it, Rob. Let's talk about the games this weekend from an X's and O's and a point spread perspective. Now, not so much whether a win or a loss will get you in or out, but there's going to be games on the field, and there are point spreads on every single one of them. Let's start with Friday night. We mentioned a isolated game for optimal viewing Friday night. Colorado and Washington will play. Washington about a touchdown favorite against Colorado. Your thoughts on the game, the spread, how they match up, the Colorado defense against that Washington offense. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's probably, aside from, USC, Rob, this was going to be the best game. And I'm not so sure that it doesn't end up being the best match for Washington. Colorado's been tremendous all season long. Like I said earlier, probably not a lot of people know a heck of a lot about this team. Extremely explosive. They went to that new up-tempo offense this year, and we saw it right off the bat. Game 1 against Colorado State, where they had 30-plus at the half against CSU, and they really haven't looked back since with Phillip Lindsay at running back. They've had the running game going. Of course, Leifau is a very good quarterback. The receiving core has been fantastic this year. They've got home run threats. They've got possession-type threats. They can throw the bubble screens that go the distance. All that being said, the defense has really been a significant factor in the turnaround of this team. Right now, if you just look at statistical numbers overall for the season, Colorado possesses a better total yards allowed per game defense than does Washington. Colorado allows 323 this year. Washington allows 329. Very, very similar, but still you wouldn't think off the top of your head that Colorado has the better defense, but they've been good all season long, and they match up real well with this Washington team. I'm interested to see it because I think at the point of attack, Colorado in their front seven on the defensive side is tough enough, aggressive enough, strong enough to keep Washington's running game quiet. And everything Jake Browning does through the air really is predicated off of the rushing game for Washington. So this is a good matchup. You could turn that argument around and say the same thing the other way. I think you've got two teams that are very close to being mirror images of each other. Power ratings on this neutral field. Remember, this game is played at Levi Stadium in San Francisco. It's a grass field. On the neutral field, my power ratings have Washington a 6-point favorite. They opened up here 7.5, which would suggest some value towards Colorado. We have not seen any push towards the Washington side yet. Of course, we're only a couple of days in, but they remain 7.5 and in some places 7, which I think when you don't see automatic movement toward the favorite in this game, Rob, it shows you that the early bettors, the more sophisticated bettors, have that respect for Colorado in this game. I think I do too. Total opened at 60, down now to 58. I haven't quite gotten a full weather report yet on this one. We do know that turf at Levi Stadium at times has been the subject of ire for a lot of head coaches and a lot of players. For a brand new field, they've had some real issues with that field. But this year, pretty good. We'll see how this one goes, but at first glance here, early Tuesday afternoon as we speak, I think I would lean toward the underdog plus the points in that game. I just think that everything Washington can do, Colorado can do, and maybe, if not exactly as well, darn close to exactly as well.
And I think we touched on this earlier, Colorado with a win as a 2-loss Pac-12 champs going to have a really tough time battling their way into the Final Four. Even Washington, as a 1-loss team, I get the impression you feel the same way I do, isn't guaranteed a spot in the playoff. Let's say Washington is a 1-loss team and Clemson doesn't lose and Penn State wins. I think that's the most likely scenario where Washington would get left out. Your thoughts?
Yeah, boy, it's hard for us to put ourselves in the committee's shoes because I don't know that there's any hardcore criteria that they judge this on. I think they have a set of things that they're looking at, but they kind of backfit for their own argument. Those things they might rearrange numbers 4 and 6 on their list of priorities when they're looking at these teams for somebody, and then reverse it back to 4th and 6th for a different team. It's real hard to tell what they'll consider in this instance, but I do think that Colorado needs multiple things to happen, right? They really do. They probably need a Clemson loss. Or in Washington with a Clemson loss and a Penn State victory, boy, that's tough too, because you could almost say that Penn State and Ohio State, it's going to be hard to get around two Big Ten teams. I'll put it that way. If Penn State wins, they've got such an argument. Not only did they win their division, win their conference, beat Ohio State, who, would probably be in, it's hard to leave them out. That's two Big Ten teams. If Wisconsin wins, I think it's hard to leave Wisconsin out. They've got a victory non-conference over LSU. They played a rugged schedule all season long. So for Washington, best case scenario is that Clemson goes down. Otherwise, they're at the mercy of the committee. And I got to tell you, Rob, I have no clue which way they're going to go with this stuff. You and I said it earlier. It'd be a great year for 8 because you can make legitimate cases for 8. And perhaps after all these games are played, you'll still be able to make real good cases for 6. But there's only 4 spots to go around, so we'll see.
Absolutely. There's more teams than spots this year, more than in years past. In terms of Washington's biggest weakness, we talked about their strength of schedule. They did, in fairness to Washington, they schedule these games years ahead of time, and they just so happen to have Rutgers on their schedule, which is probably a mid-tier Big Ten team in most years. Unfortunately, they're just really down right now, and they're going to perhaps suffer because of that.
Yeah, they would. They actually do get, I don't know how much of a boost, but you'll get somewhat of a boost from Idaho. Idaho becomes a bowl team this year, for what it's worth, out of the Sun Belt. So, when they schedule them, because it's a geographical game that they like to play every year, you don't expect Idaho to be more than a 2-3 win team, but this year they did, so maybe they get a little bump for that. The Pac-12 just being what it was this year, with Stanford being down a little bit, with Oregon being down a ton, with UCLA not being very good, with Arizona State not being very good. There just wasn't much with Cal being down this year. There's just not enough strength in that league, despite the ascension of Colorado and Washington State. There's not enough strength in that league to go around. So I think they're penalized a lot for the league that they're in. That's why when they actually played USC, it was such a huge game for them. They wound up losing that one. But this could be, like I said earlier, this could be very big for them. Colorado sits at number 9 right now in the college football playoff rankings. And to get a crack at a top 10 team is huge for Washington. What they do with this opportunity, we'll see. My thought would be they have to win this game by a couple of touchdowns to really open up the committee's eyes. If they win this game by 3 points and a squeaker, boy, I don't know. We'll see. Again, I just don't know what the considerations are going to be. You'd love to be in that room when they make the decision, I'll tell you that, but I just don't know what the considerations are going to be with what they'll have to work with once all of these games are over with.
Yeah, I got to tell you something. If they weren't all, the committee people weren't all so afraid of their every word being leaked out and everything they say, I think it would make great reality television to not necessarily live while they're debating it, but after the fact, the next day to have a 6 or 8 hour feed of these guys sitting in a room. I can tell you, I would most certainly watch it.
Yeah, boy, what fodder that would make for talk radio and talk television and everything else, too. You and I could listen to that and then sit and do a podcast off of what we've heard, because there would be so many arguments the other way. They're going to be, let's put it this way, they're going to be in a no-win situation. No matter what they do, they're going to get criticized for what they didn't do, and it's not really their fault. Like you just stated it best, there's more spots or more teams that should be in than there's spots to go around. It's a tough place to be in. They're kind of boxed in this situation. They'll do the best they can. The one thing I hope they don't do, Rob, is I hope they don't pick 4 teams based on who's going to bring the biggest fan base, which we know happens in bowl games all the time. Whoever's going to bring the most fans, money drives everything. I would hope in this situation that perhaps Washington doesn't get shut out because maybe the Huskies fan base isn't that of what would come from Penn State, what would come from Wisconsin, what would come from Clemson. These games, I believe these 2 games this year are Fiesta and Peach. So, we'll see. I hope that's not one of the things that's integrated into the process.
Well, it will be interesting to see what they do should Washington be a one-loss Pac-12 champion. Let's move on to the Saturday games, and I'm just going to kind of take the big 4, and I'm going to do them in what I consider the order of least important to most important, with the middle 2 could really go either way as far as I'm concerned. But we'll start with the SEC title game. Alabama's a big favorite over Florida. I don't think they're going to lose. I don't think you think they're going to lose. I don't think many people think there's a chance that they lose. And I think even if they were to lose, they'd still be in the playoff. But break it down nonetheless.
Yeah, Alabama is probably a bit overpriced here, but they've been overpriced all year long, and they've covered numbers when they've been overpriced. So I don't think that the odds makers have done anything wrong. Their power ratings said this game should have opened 18.5. It opened 21.5. But the odds makers know where the money's going to come from. They absolutely know that there's not many people coming with their money pointed towards the Florida Gators. It's going to be all pointed towards Alabama, so you have to pad it a little bit. That being said, even after they opened it at 21.5, money pushed it all the way to 24 to show you what the early guys thought of this matchup. They thought 21.5 was too cheap. When you have a game, Rob, like this one, where the line is favorite minus 24 and the total is 40.5, it's very hard not to take a correlating parlay of favorite and over, because you figure if you're going to win by more than 24, the game has to score more than 40.5 points, especially in modern-day college football. In order for it to stay under, you're talking about games 31-3, which of course is possible, 34-3, 34-6, barely stays under. So I think you might see some people push toward Bama and over. Interesting note about the SEC championship game, the last 7 games that have been played have all gone over the total. And the SEC is usually the best defensive conference in the country. So sometimes in these conference championship games, if they get out of reach, the underdog realizes at some point that they no longer have a chance, and these games get out of hand. And a lot of times that leads to over. So there's a lot of angles to look at this one from. I don't think we need to tell anybody listening how good the Alabama defense is. I mean, we're talking about a group that hasn't allowed a touchdown in 15 quarters now. We don't have to tell anybody listening how dreadful the Florida offense is. They've just been in their own way all season long. Jim McElwain has not been able to get these guys to consistently produce. All that being said, last year I took Florida in this same matchup, plus 16 last year. They lose that game 29-15 because their defense was good enough to contain Alabama. Is their defense this year good enough once again to contain Alabama, or will Jalen Hurts and company, blow them out and score a lot of points here? That's what you have to decide for yourself. I think that decision alone would lead a handicapper or a bettor to make the play that he's going to make.
I mean, I don't even know if there's an answer to this next question, but is there anything that could happen on the field Saturday that could make Florida come out on top of this game?
There'd have to be a couple of interception returns, I would think, Rob, because that's one of their best ways of scoring. If you think back to last year, in that game, Florida ran a punt back for a touchdown, and at the very end, because they weren't covering until the very end of this game, when they played it last year. They threw a long touchdown pass. So they got one bomb, and they got a punt return for touchdown to get their scoring for the day. That's how they covered. That could be how they cover again. With 24 points, if you can find your way to 15 like they did last year, that forces Alabama to get 39 to beat you. 38 is still a push. They have to get 39 to beat you. So I would say for Florida, and I guess you probably mean from a straight-up perspective. And
I did, but this is interesting as well.
Straight-up perspective, obviously, when I'm telling you they need 14 to cover the game, I'm probably not looking at them to win it. They would have to be on the basis that they could score a couple of defensive touchdowns, maybe special teams, block a punt or something. But that type of thing has to come into play here for them because, let's face it, how often are they going to move the football consistently down the field? It's just not going to happen for them. They need to be blessed with short fields. They need to have turnovers that immediately turn into points and maybe a special team score as well. And then you got to play outstanding defense because Alabama has so many weapons. So we'll see.
And I think the biggest disadvantage to Florida is you look out when a kid goes and beats a Clemson or an Iowa knocks off a Michigan, and you go, we didn't think that was going to happen, but we could see how it happened, and you really start analyzing it, and you see some of the deficiencies of a Clemson, or you see Michigan struggling a little bit on offense and getting into one of those Big Ten dogfights. I don't see Alabama having any of the deficiencies that some of these other top-tier teams have that Florida might be able to take advantage of, and there's not going to be a pro-Florida crowd there to urge them on either.
Yeah, the only way to get a deficiency out of Alabama is to create one yourself. And I guess if you want to create one and you're the Florida Gators, what you would have to do is completely shut down the ground game, including Jalen Hurts. Completely shut down the ground game and force them to be down in distance, handicapped for a majority of the game, and force them to be a passing team in order to move the football, because I still don't believe that, as good as he's been, that Jalen Hurts is super accurate with his passes in a consistent manner. So I think that they would have to create that deficiency out of Alabama. Nobody's been able to do it all season long with the exception of LSU. LSU held Alabama to 10 points, and, you and I both saw that game start to finish, and I know that on that particular day, I think we both had a play on LSU first half. In the end, Alabama goes on a 90-yard drive to score their only touchdown of the game in the fourth quarter. LSU finally gave one up. That's about as good a defensive performance as you could give, and they still weren't able to beat that team, and they were on their home field. So it's difficult. I mean, we're not telling anybody anything new, but it's difficult to beat Alabama.
Well, Rob, let's jump ahead to the ACC title game. Clemson at 10-1 or 11-1 now, rather, going up against the Virginia Tech team that has no shot of making the college football playoff. Clemson in the top 4 right now. Would expect them to stay there when the rankings come out again Tuesday night. Winning, they're in, right?
Winning, they're in, yeah. That would be automatic. Winning, they're in.
And in terms of on the field, they are a pretty good-sized favorite over Virginia Tech. What do you think? Is Clemson going to come out and have a dominating performance, or do you see Virginia Tech being able to do enough and expose some of Clemson's deficiencies? And we've seen Clemson not play their best football quite a few times this year. If that happens and Clemson isn't playing their best football, I think Virginia Tech's got a shot to keep it close. I do, however, think Deshaun Watson understands the moment. He's an experienced player, and I think that will be the difference on Saturday. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're Virginia Tech, at least you have the right tools to bring to the fight. When you look at games where Clemson struggled, they basically struggled from a defensive perspective, and they struggled against spread attacks with solid threat quarterbacks, dual threat quarterbacks, right? I mean, they play against Louisville, they win 42-36. Obviously, Lamar Jackson, Heisman leading contender for the Heisman this year. No further explanation there. Louisville can score points. But then you go down and you see that they beat Florida State 37-34. Again, a dual threat quarterback, an explosive offense. Dalvin Cook at running back had some huge runs in that game, especially second half. Clemson was tested, only won by 3. And they played the Pittsburgh Panthers and they actually lose the game 43-42. Pittsburgh was one of the best offensive teams in the nation this year. So you get the idea here. The common denominator in all 3 of those games where Clemson barely survived, Louisville, Florida State, and Pittsburgh, they didn't survive. If you can bring a high-powered, multi-dimensional offense with a dual-threat quarterback to the battle, you're going to have a shot. Virginia Tech brings all of that. Gerard Evans has been fantastic at quarterback for Virginia Tech this year. We've talked about him a lot. Justin Fuente's offensive system, obviously coming over from Memphis, is one that's wide open. Run the ball, throw the ball, the quick-hitting screens, the up-tempo type stuff. So, Virginia Tech is not sloppy with the football. You could definitely see this being a game, no doubt about it. And you could see it being a high-scoring game because Clemson's going to use those same apply those same tools against Virginia Tech when Virginia Tech's on defense. Now, what's interesting here is that, this is a conference, obviously, with 2 divisions to play the conference championship game. And in the crossover games, Clemson and Virginia Tech didn't match up this year. So this will be the first meeting. Defensive coordinator Bud Foster for Virginia Tech was retained by Justin Fuente when he took the head coaching job. So Bud Foster knows plenty about Deshaun Watson and this group of Clemson Tigers. Whether or not he can slow them down is another question. I personally don't know that they'll be able to. But I could see this being a higher scoring affair with Watson and Evans going at it up and down the field. I think Clemson really has gotten into offensive gear the last 4 weeks of the season, 5 weeks of the season. They kind of struggled offensively to start the season, not with yardage, but with finishing drives, silly turnovers. I think back to the Troy game. That's the game where Ray McCloud actually ran. The NC State game, they had a ton of yardage in the first half. They only had about 10 points. They gave the ball away inside the 25-yard line, I think, 3 times in that game. So, it was their own self-inflicted wounds when they weren't scoring a lot of points. But lately they've been scoring points. I mean, last week 56 against South Carolina, 35 against a good Wake Forest D, 42, 54, 37. They've been rolling since that NC State game. That's kind of the way I see it, Rob. I think Virginia Tech's got a legitimate shot. They've got nothing to lose. And it's, like I say, for Fuente to get here in his first year with this team, fantastic. It's good for Virginia Tech to be back on the scene. And I think they'll give him a pretty good game now.
Yeah, not a conference championship game, but a big game nonetheless. Early Saturday afternoon, Bedlam, Oklahoma hosts Oklahoma State. I bet you Oklahoma State really wishes, we talked about this several times, that the refs knew the rules, because if they could have pull off an upset on Saturday, they'd be sitting as a one-loss Big 12 champion saying, here I am, how can you leave me out? But instead, they've got 2 losses. Oklahoma also has 2 losses after their upset loss to Houston to open the season, and then a tough loss at home to Ohio State. Should be a great game nonetheless for the Big 12 championship. Don't really see any realistic path for either of these teams in a 4-team playoff. In an 8-team playoff, the winner absolutely goes But break the game down for us.
Yeah, I think right now Oklahoma is just, like I said earlier, they're in that breath with USC of a team nobody wanted to see at this point in time. Oklahoma's, since they've gotten healthy, that offense has been unstoppable. Everything we thought Oklahoma would be on the offensive side of the football back in August, they are right now. When you can combine Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon at running back, and now the way Dede Westbrook has taken over at wide receiver is reminiscent of the way Sterling Shepard did it last year. We see Sterling Shepard catching passes for the New York Giants on Sundays now. And, of course, they've had the solid quarterback play all season long. The defense hasn't been quite as good as some previous Bob Stoops additions, but in Big 12 play, you don't have to be phenomenal on defense to win games by 3 touchdowns. I think Oklahoma State's going to have a hard time keeping pace here. I really do. They're as good as it gets offensively as well, but I think they can be exposed a lot easier on the defensive side of the football than Oklahoma can. Oklahoma State's had some close calls this year, but they've had some good wins too. We talked about how good of a team Pittsburgh is offensively. Remember, OSU beat Pittsburgh early in the season. The total on this particular football game will give you some idea to what the odds makers think. I mean, it opens 78. It's down to 77.5, so they're basically telling you 38-38 isn't good enough to cash an over ticket. You need more than that. And I'd kind of be surprised if you didn't get more than that. And for Oklahoma State to hold the Sooners at this point in time under 48, 49 points, I don't think that's happening. But that being said, Oklahoma State is going to be able to score their share as well. Game sits now at about 11. Oklahoma has an 11-point favorite. They opened up at 12.5, so there's been some Oklahoma State money here. Power ratings showed this game to be Oklahoma minus 12, so I was basically right in line with where they opened this one. One more time, Rob. It's a huge game for both, obviously from the rivalry perspective, but when conference championship is on the line as well, it becomes even bigger. I just think Oklahoma's too good at this point in time for Oklahoma State. We'll see how it goes, but I think that Oklahoma probably wins this one you need to win by 12-13 to cover this game. I think they can do that.
Well, Rob, that unless we decide to talk about Army-Navy next week, that sadly will be the last regular season college football game we talk about this season. As the regular season comes to an end, that leaves us with one conference championship game to break down, and it is probably going to be the most watched conference championship game of the weekend, one would think. And it's also the game that has the most chance of impacting everybody else's chances of getting into the college football playoff, and that is Wisconsin and Penn State. Both teams have 2 losses. Both teams are ranked just outside of the top 4 right now. I guess first question becomes, does the winner automatically get a spot in the Final Four?
I guess that because of my partiality to thinking that Wisconsin deserves it if they win, I would probably have to say yes. I think if Penn State wins this game, their argument is just too strong to be left out. Even though, let me preface that by saying, Rob, I'm still amazed at what Penn State is doing, and I can still honestly say that I don't really believe Penn State's one of the 4 best teams in the country. But when you can bring the argument, if you're going to take Ohio State, we beat Ohio State. We won our division. We won our conference championship. It's so hard to leave a team like that out. That would be an argument that, how would you defend not letting them in at that point if you were going to let Ohio State in? I think the only way to not let Penn State in is to keep Ohio State out of the mix as well. Say, well, Ohio State's not in, so your win over Ohio State and you beating them for the division doesn't mean as much. But I can't get over what Wisconsin's done, Rob. I mean, what we looked at the beginning of the season when you and I first started podcasting, and I think it was about week 1 when they played LSU, and we took a look at their schedule. And first of all, didn't believe they were going to beat LSU. They were like a 10-point underdog. Sure enough, they did. And then when we looked down the ledger, thought, well, this is going to be, at least a 3, probably 4-loss team. And they started to go through people. The fact that they lost to Michigan 14-7 in a game that they could have won, in a game where they had to start Alex Hornibrook, a kid who had never taken a snap from center as a starter before, run him out there, barely lose the game, come back the next week, beat Ohio State. So Wisconsin's going to have the same argument. We beat Ohio State as well. They lost to Ohio State by 7 in that contest. But, again, it was with the banged-up defense. I think they had a couple linebackers out, and Hornibrook was in his second start. Just a tough stretch. I would kind of look at them. It's hard. I guess we could all make cases. Go ahead. Tell me what you think of Penn State. I mean, you're the Penn State guy. I know Franklin's turned it around, and it would be, to me, impossible to leave him out if he wins this game.
I sadly agree with you. I think it's impossible to leave them out. I also still think they're one of the most overrated teams in all of college football. They're hanging their hat on a 17-point fourth-quarter comeback against an Ohio State team that was coming off of – it was a situational play on Penn State that night. You're hanging your hat on that win against Ohio State, who's coming off an overtime win on the road against Wisconsin, and then has to go on the road the following week to Penn State. I mean, yes, Penn State won that game, but I remember the first time the rankings came out, and I saw Penn State as high as they were. The first thing I said to you is I have them in my rankings as double-digit dogs to Oklahoma and LSU, and you responded, I do too. So that's kind of where I think we're at with Penn State. But I think they have the more convincing argument than Wisconsin, unfortunately, because if you look at what the criteria are, it's head-to-head record, conference championships. Penn State would have both over Ohio State. If you're going to put Ohio State in, you absolutely have to put Penn State in as well. And I think in that case, the odd team out, assuming Clemson wins, would probably be Washington. I think the neatest and cleanest way for the College Football Committee to take care of all this would be to have either Colorado beat Washington or Virginia Tech upset Clemson. Then you'd put in Alabama, you'd put in Ohio State, the winner of the Big Ten championship game, and whoever doesn't lose either Clemson or Washington.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Rob, when you look at how Penn State, I still don't understand how they climbed the rankings so fast, because you're right. Until the fourth quarter of that Ohio State game, there's nobody in the world that considered them a top 10 or top 12, whatever they were.
They weren't even in the top 25.
I mean, they needed a miracle fourth quarter just to win a game. Not to get on the map, just to win a game. They needed that. Now, since then, and they were, unlike Wisconsin, who wasn't granted an easy ride in crossover games by the schedule maker, Penn State was granted an easy ride when it came to playing teams from the West Division this year. When they played the West, they played Minnesota. They won by a field goal. Minnesota's a good team, don't get me wrong, but they played Minnesota. After that, they played Purdue, who we know is a bad football team. And last week, they played Michigan State, who's in a severely down year. They didn't have rough games. Their victories since Ohio State are Purdue, Indiana, Rutgers, Michigan State, and Iowa, which we can give them half a bit of credit for. But they haven't beaten anybody solid. They got crushed by Michigan. They did beat Temple, but lost to Pittsburgh. I just don't know how they got what formula was used to get Penn State to the position that they're into today. I really don't think we should be talking about them as a potential college football playoff team if they win their conference championship. In my mind, even if they win the game, they're still not. But that's where we're at. and somehow, some way, whatever formula they used, put Penn State so high up in the rankings at the outset that they've just done the rest since then. They've won football games. They've gained confidence. They've won football games. I don't know that they're good enough to beat Wisconsin, to tell you the truth. What Wisconsin has shown me this year is, especially on the defensive side of the football, is tremendous.
Let's break it down from an X's and O's perspective. I think the line opened at Wisconsin -3, and I think that if I'm looking at it correctly, a little bit of Penn State money moved this down to under a field goal game now.
Yeah, that's where it's at. It's 2-point Wisconsin favorite or 1.5. If you like Wisconsin, you can even find 1.5 out there right now with a total that opened at 47.5. Now bet down to 46.5. Game played at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, home of the Indianapolis Colts. So you got perfect weather conditions here. Nothing to worry about. You know, what Penn State has done from an offensive perspective since the Ohio State game has been the real significant gain of that team in my mind. James Franklin had to make a couple of decisions. You and I have beat this horse to death. But when they hired Joe Moorhead as offensive coordinator to start the year, the idea was they needed to throw the football better, and he was going to incorporate the tight end as part of the passing game. They went out there. They tried to throw for 3 games. They weren't real successful. Trace McSorley's not exactly your typical passing quarterback. And Franklin wanted to play, at that point, let's go with my style. My style is I like a dual-threat quarterback. I like to throw the ball when we're on rollouts and sprint outs and stuff like that. Use the quarterback in the running game more. Since that day, they've been better offensively. There's no doubt about it. They've had massive amount of injuries to the linebacking core all season long, but somehow they've overcome it. I think in the end they've overcome it by just outscoring defenses that aren't very good. Penn State's got enough of games.
I don't think they're going to be able to outscore the Wisconsin defense. I think that if Penn State's going to win this game, they're going to have to play better defensively than they have. And they did look much better defensively, especially in the second half against Michigan State. But again, you can't use that as a barometer, one half against Michigan State. But overall, they're not going to be able to put up 35 points against this Wisconsin defense. I just don't see that happening. And if they're going to win this game, their defense is going to have to keep this into a game where first to 24 wins.
Yeah, you know, everything you say, I totally agree with. First off, this is a major step up in class in defensive opponent for Penn State. I mean, the reality is, who have they played that's good defensively down the stretch? Since the Ohio State game, once again, they played Purdue. They played Indiana, which wore out. Indiana was a good defensive team first 5 weeks. No depth. They wore out towards the end of the year. They played Rutgers, a horrendous defensive team, and they played Michigan State, a team that you wouldn't even recognize their defense as a Michigan State defense this season. So Wisconsin, leaps and bounds better defensively than anything they've seen in 5 weeks since the Ohio State game. Secondly, as far as the Wisconsin offense is concerned, I think that it's probably the most physical offense that they'll have seen. You still have to contend with this Wisconsin offensive line pounding on you for four quarters. Can Penn State hold up? They're not flashy, Wisconsin. They don't try to be flashy. They're going to run the football. They're going to throw short passes. They're going to try and play field position. This is a different style opponent than anything Penn State has seen recently. I think that the opponents they beat down the stretch were kind of hand-in-glove fits for what they were doing well. This isn't that hand-in-glove fit. If you can't tell, I like the Wisconsin side in this game. I think if you're asking me, on a neutral field, can Wisconsin beat Penn State by 3 points? I would just off of the gap of defensive ability alone, I think I would play Wisconsin to win by a field goal. So that's where I'm going to go here. Real quick, power ratings say Wisconsin is 4 points better than Penn State on a neutral field. Once again, they still play the games. We do have to see what happens, but I really think Wisconsin has been a little bit shortchanged all season long, and I think they'll come through here. I think they'll come through. A very well-coached team, and like I say, what they've done this year has been very, very impressive.
Well, Rob, I guess since we talked about all the big games, it's time to make a Final Four prediction. First, before you do that, though, who do your power rankings have as the best 4 teams in college football? Because I always say we should let Vegas take the Final Four.
You know, if Las Vegas was picking the Final Four, I could almost virtually guarantee you this is what they would be. Alabama would be number 1. Clemson would be number 2. In fact, power ratings-wise, Clemson and Ohio State sit in a flat-footed tie. So rate them however you want, 2, 3, or a pair of 2s. But those would be the first 3 teams, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State. And the number 4 team would be Michigan, power rating-wise. They're still the 4th strongest. They are a point better than Washington and LSU at this point in time. So if Michigan played Washington on a neutral field, you'd probably see the line Michigan -1. And I think that's a valid line. Michigan -1 on a neutral field. So despite the fact that Michigan is a team that's out of it, in Las Vegas's eyes, in oddsmakers' eyes, in handicappers' eyes with power ratings, Michigan is still one of your 4 best teams in the nation.
I guess the one other question I want to ask before we do the Final Four is, how far down do you have to go to hit USC and Oklahoma? I think they're 2 very, very good football teams. And then how far down do you have to go to find Penn State on that list?
I knew you were going there. Real quickly, you don't have to go far to find Oklahoma and USC because, as I said, it goes Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Michigan, and then your next 4 are LSU and Washington, again in a flat-footed tie, Oklahoma and USC. USC, only 2 points less in power ratings than Michigan, the 4th-place team. So if Michigan played USC on a neutral field, Michigan would be a 2-point favorite against USC. So that's how bunched up they are. The difference between 2, excuse me, Rob, the difference between 2 and 8, disregard Alabama, just take Clemson all the way through to USC, those 8 teams right there, or those 7 teams right there, and you only have 2.5 points worth of difference. They're so interchangeable, it's crazy. And that's why, you know, like we were saying earlier, to have 8 teams in this year would be great. If that were your 8-team playoff field, it'd be a sensational 8-team playoff for sure. Of course, you know, LSU's rated that high with the batch of losses that they have. But that's where they sit, and that's where the odds makers obviously hold them too. When we're making point spreads on games, LSU is that high. For Penn State, you'd have to zip all the way down to number 14 in the nation. They, just comparatively speaking to you now, I've given you Michigan as the common denominator here a couple of times because they're the 4th-ranked team. If Penn State played Michigan on a neutral field this afternoon, Michigan would be a 9-point favorite. That's how far down you have to go to find Penn State. So odds makers have them a shade higher, Rob, because like I said to you earlier, my power ratings show Wisconsin should be 4-point favorites in this game on Saturday, and the odds makers opened them up 3. So maybe they have Penn State a point better. Maybe they have Wisconsin a point worse, but it's not very much. Penn State certainly is not a top 4 college football team in anybody's eyes that deals with handicapping football games or making lines.
And who do you have, Rob? Let's put it out there. Come Sunday at high noon in the East, when they reveal 1 to 4, how do you see it?
Well, I'll say this. I do think there's the possibility that both Washington and Clemson lose. That possibility exists. Like you said earlier, Alabama's not going to lose. We know that. But for sake of this conversation, I will say that we end up with Alabama, we end up with Ohio State, we end up with, I will say, a Clemson and Wisconsin, because I think Wisconsin will beat Penn State and eliminate that argument. So I'll say it goes that way. But like I said earlier, it's not going to shock me if Clemson gets themselves into trouble against Virginia Tech. But I'll go with that. I'll go with Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Wisconsin. The team that gets left at the door is Washington. They'll have a huge gripe. You'll have to line Washington up against Wisconsin and see which of those two teams you like better. In my mind, unless Washington goes out and destroys Colorado, let's say the final score of that game is 42-17 or something like that, then maybe I think differently. But I don't see that happening, so I'm going to go that route. I'm going to go with those four.
Not far off from you. I have it as Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, the winner of the Big Ten championship game, so we'll say Wisconsin. I think the one caveat could be if Clemson and Washington both were to lose, then you would have the Pac-12 champion in, assuming it's Washington. If it's not Washington, it wouldn't stun me. I don't think this will happen. I could see it being Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, winner of the Big Ten championship game.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you. Michigan can find their way right back in the door if Clemson and Washington both lose, because at that point, our pool of teams to choose from becomes Michigan, Oklahoma, and Colorado. And which of those three do you want? I think that they would probably go with, I don't think they'd go with Colorado, because Michigan has beaten Colorado already this year. And I just don't know that they would go with Oklahoma, but it would probably come down to that.
Again, because Ohio State has beaten Oklahoma this year.
Yeah, and Ohio State's beaten Michigan. It would be, but that's what we would be down to. Absolutely right, and that's how Michigan finds their way back in the door. They're sitting home this week, and they're hoping for a Clemson loss to Virginia Tech. They're hoping for a Washington loss to Colorado. And all of a sudden, you got a little bit of chaos, and you may find Michigan right back in the door.
Well, Rob, it's been fun. It'll be very interesting to see what happens on Sunday afternoon. And, of course, obviously Friday night through Saturday at about midnight when everything finally settles. It'll be a very interesting weekend of football, the most meaningful weekend of football of the year in terms of who's going to make the playoffs. Any final words, thoughts?
Well, you know what? You and I have talked a lot this year, Rob, real quick, about which team from the non-Power 5 conferences, the group of five, will make the New Year's Day Bowl of Six game. I think it's the Cotton Bowl this year. And right now, Western Michigan's going to play for an undefeated season, right, on Friday night, the MAC championship against Ohio U, a game in which they're favored by 18.5, 19 points. However, Navy's going to play for a conference championship, too, against a far better opponent in Temple. And I'm wondering, because last week's rankings, and we haven't seen tonight's yet, but last Tuesday night's rankings had Western Michigan at 21 and Navy only 4 spots behind at 25. The Boise loss last week to Air Force obviously eliminated them, so it's down to Western Michigan and Navy. And for me, I wonder if Navy can jump Western Michigan, even if they both win, because Navy is playing a Temple team that, you know, when you line them up against Ohio U, it's a far more difficult opponent. So we'll see. To me, that'll be of interest. Those two teams, which one gets that spot in the Cotton Bowl? The Navy
well,
midshipmen.
Rob, here's a great question for you. Let's just play this out for a second. Western Michigan gets upset. Navy beats Temple, then loses to Army.
How about that? Well, I wonder. Yeah, wow. I guess they would have to hold the bowl bid back until the Army game gets played. Interesting that you wouldn't be able to accept an invitation into the Cotton Bowl after your conference championship, but the way the schedule works this year, you're absolutely right. And then if Navy loses,
then, are you looking at the winner of San Diego State and Wyoming? Where do you go from there? San Diego State wins. Is it San Diego State, even though they lost to South Alabama this year?
And you'd have to see tonight how far down the list Boise fell with that Air Force game. But, yeah, that's a great question.
But isn't one of the criteria you have to have won your conference?
Conference championship, yeah. That is one of the criteria. So I guess the next one in line would be the winner of Western Kentucky, Louisiana Tech out of CUSA, but I don't think they could get high enough. So you know what? Western Michigan probably would go. I guess that's the easiest way to sum that up. Although I would be interested to see where Western Kentucky sits tonight when we see these rankings come out. Louisiana Tech had a bad loss last week to Southern Miss. Otherwise, they would be in the picture. But they lost, so we'll see. It could be as much chaos on that end as it is on the Final Four end.
Well, Rob, that will do it for our college conference championship early look. We will let's agree to circle back after the bowl games are all announced, and we'll do a mega preview show. Maybe we'll break it down into a couple of different parts and take all the games and just kind of go through them and give our projections. One other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on real quick, if you don't mind, is there's going to be some 5 and 7 teams going to bowls this year. Not enough bowl-eligible teams. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it makes somebody happy to go to a bowl game and get an extra 15 practices, because when you're talking about the 5 and 7, and I did see the list, and it's a very short list, but it's not going to be a Power 5 team in most instances. South Alabama has a chance to lock one up this week with a 6th victory, but the 5 and 7 that I saw earlier, I can't even recall right now off the top of my head. But in this case, you hate to send the 5 and 7, but the fact is, if it's a team from a non-Power 5 conference that could use the extra 15 practices and the appearance in a bowl game, then I guess it's a good thing for that particular university. But boy, you got to try and. Here we are. It's funny, right? On the top end of this, you and I are in total agreement that there's just not enough spots for so many good teams, and at the bottom end of this, there's not enough teams to fill bowl slots. It's kind of crazy.
Well, I guess the top teams, I guess they go to APR, which is some kind of academic progress rating, to determine what 5 and 7 teams would get to go. The first one on the list is North Texas. The second on the list is Mississippi State, an SEC school. The third one is Texas. I can't imagine them accepting a bowl bid at this point. And then the fourth is Northern Illinois in terms of the APR. You're likely going to be able to slot Hawaii in will get preference at 6 and 7, and Army would also get preference at 6 and 6, even though 2 of their wins came over non-Division I schools.
Yeah, the North Texas team was the one I couldn't think of off the top of my head, which would be a good thing for them with Seth Luttrell coming in and taking over as head coach in his first season. A team like that can absolutely use the 15 extra practice sessions. For Power 5 teams, it's usually more of an embarrassment than a reward. I'd be interested to see if Dan Mullen and Mississippi State has the opportunity, whether they accept or turn it down. But I know for North Texas it would be a good thing.
I mean, and then you just go down the list. The other ones that would have the in order would be Arizona State, Cal, Ole Miss. Then you get into some interesting ones, some teams you might like to see in a bowl game. UL Lafayette, they actually have a game against Louisiana Monroe Saturday. If they win, they'll become bowl eligible on their own. And then below that, you've got Nevada, Akron, and SMU, some other interesting teams to say the least.
Yeah, like I said earlier, too, I think South Alabama, because the Sun Belt does play a regular season week this week to end their season. I think South Alabama can control their own destiny as well. They can get themselves to 6 wins, much like UL Lafayette. And you could see 2 of those teams sneak 2 of the bowl bids out and then leave whatever's left after that point.
I think there's there's only going to be 3 or 4 spots, I think, that need to be filled by 5 and 7 teams.
So if you're handicapping games this week, try to keep that in mind, that South Alabama and UL Lafayette have an awful lot to play for here this week. And UL Lafayette has been extremely hot as of the last 3 weeks, I guess. It's a team that was expected to do a lot, didn't early, but late in the season, as evidenced by that win last week, they've come on pretty strong.
Well, Rob, that will do it for us. We will circle back. Before we go, just want to remind everybody, RobVinoSports.com, all of the great power ratings that Rob goes over for us each and every week, injury reports, weather reports, all kinds of statistical information, and, of course, plays from Rob, myself, and Derek Davis are available, RobVinoSports.com. For Rob Vino, I'm Rob O'Connor. Thanks for listening. Enjoy championship weekend.